You're listening to the Ask a Theologian podcast, where we explore the intersection of theology and everyday life. I'm your host, Dave, and I really hope you enjoy today's episode. So sit back, grab a coffee, and enjoy. Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of Ask a Theologian. I'm thrilled today to have Dr. Susan Maros with us. Dr. Maros is an associate professor of Christian leadership at Fuller Theological Seminary. And she's also the author of several articles and a couple of books that we're going to be talking about today, Calling in Context and Power, Agency, and Women in the Mission of God. She also serves as past president of the Academy of Religious Leadership and she lives in California. And I'll give you a little hint. There's a little smoke on some of her possessions at the moment. Dr. Maros, thank you for taking time to join me here today.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it's been incredibly busy for you, so I do value your time today. Okay, before we get started, kind of jumping in on your talking about your books, which you've written a lot about identities, how identities shape our sense of calling. But before we dive into that, can you share just at maybe a personal moment or when your particular social location as a woman scholar, parent, either clarified or complicated your vocation?
Well, in one sense, certainly in processing my own sense of calling, my sense of what is God doing in my life and around me, and what's God's invitation to me to participate with God's work in the world. Um, Having both grown up and then as a young adult being in pretty conservative evangelical circles,
Okay.
um, being female was an issue I had to process.
Okay. Sure.
So my context said that as a woman, I certainly could be called of God, but it was to be a wife and a mother. It was maybe to help with children's ministries. Maybe I could be the women's ministries director.
Right.
But when I sensed God's calling to preach and to lead, my context did not think that that was coherent with my gender.
Sure.
So that's an example of it was a particular point of my identity that I had to process. What were the theological and cultural assumptions in my
Right.
context?
Right.
How do I perceive God? How do I make sense of that? How do I make sense of scripture that my context was using to say that my calling, my sense of calling was not from God?
Right.
How do I process that? So
Right.
that's an example that I
Excellent.
share with a lot of women.
Sure. Excellent. And I've been looking forward to this conversation. Just as on a personal note, my theology really sits in the egalitarian area, but there's always frameworks and systems around where I suddenly go, "Hang on, that's still not right." But most recently, my youngest daughter, who did her undergrad in women's studies and communication, and has always been very egalitarian, has been listening to some theology podcasts, and suddenly came to me the other day and said, "Dad, are you sure we're not? Are you sure we're egalitarian? That we're not maybe complementarians?"
Huh.
And, that bothers me a lot. That bothers me a lot, so you wrote your book, Calling in Context, really to help people walk through that process.
Mhm.
But I know that the book really resists a simplistic, understanding of calling, but can we at least kinda define the word calling, what we mean by calling?
Mhm. Yeah, and that's actually what started me down this road is what do we mean by calling,
Right.
right? I was an educator. I was teaching undergrad, mostly adults, people really angsting. It was a Pentecostal context, so there was this really
Sure.
high value for burning bush, road to Damascus kind of
Right.
experiences. At the same time, people were totally suspicious anytime somebody said, "I heard from God." They were completely
Mhm.
suspicious,
Sure.
which is really interesting. 'Cause they know it can be abused. They knew that,
Yes.
that
Sure.
that "I heard from God" language can be abused. So it was that got me going in my doctoral studies in the first place, was what in the world's going on here?
Mm.
And what I discovered was that question, "What do we mean by calling?" is actually the central question.
Right. Right.
What do we understand calling to be? What is the nature of calling? And when we say calling or we say vocation, what do we mean by those words? What are the mental maps of the world, in a sense, that we
Yes.
have. Oh, this is what the world's like. This is what people are like. This is what God's like.
Hmm.
Vocation means X. Well, what is X?
Right.
So given your question is not what does the whole wide world think, which is what I'm really curious about. And I process that with people. I think that's
Right.
really important. It's like, what are the assumptions under the questions you're asking? But I think what you're asking me is how do I define it
Sure.
personally?
Yeah.
And what I was advocating for more or less in the book is I my sense of what calling is really rooted in the concept of the missio Dei, that
Mhm.
God is actively at work in the world,
Right.
and that as God's people, we're invited by God to participate with that work.
Right.
And so my calling is that place that is my work.
Right.
And vocational formation is the lifelong process of discerning and participating with God's work in the world.
So could we say then that I mean, I grew up Pentecostal as well, and with all of the implications that that includes, but the idea of calling in, in 40 years ago was you were called to ministry.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
I suspect your definition is not that narrow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And okay, then that gets into how do we define ministry,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So for example, in my doctoral research, my participants could define possibly a teacher
Right.
as being calling because you're caring for people. There was
Mhm.
this sense of if it involves caring for people or
Okay.
helping people grow, so maybe a doctor could be a calling.
Okay.
Maybe it could be a calling if you're a fireman, any of the community helpers is what
Right.
when my kids were in preschool, they called them community helpers.
Okay.
Um, or if you needed an education. If the role required education, maybe
Okay.
that's a calling. But
Okay.
if you're working on an assembly line, that can't possibly be a calling.
Gotcha.
And so there were all of these kind of embedded sociocultural,
Mhm.
class-based assumptions about the
Right.
nature of what can and cannot be a calling. I would say whatever it is, where is God working and where are you being invited?
Right.
That could be at home with your children. That could be with your next door neighbor. That
Excellent.
could be in your role or occupation that you're paid for. That could be in a role that you're not paid for.
Right.
So what's sort of that central sense of well, certainly God's invitation. I'm also thinking that kind of central sense of drive or
Or
purpose,
mission.
which not everybody has, but mission,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Also, that sense of I keep finding myself working with people who have experienced a great deal of trauma around domestic abuse, for
Right.
example.
Right.
There's somebody in my I have in mind who
Right.
she keeps finding herself in those roles. Doors keep opening for her. She has a really powerful voice when she's in that place. I would
Right.
say that's a space in which God, it- to use a Pentecostal term, she's anointed in that space, right? You can clearly see God at work in her and through her when
Sure.
she's at work in those spaces. So I think something about her calling is in that. Does that include a paid role? Well, not always,
Right.
but
Sure.
it could.
Sure. Sure. I think Dr. Richard Park at Vanguard, he kind of talks about secular and sacred callings. That
Mm,
there's still callings, but we've tended to separate them in that
yeah,
way. So,
yeah,
but the big part of your, especially a calling and context book, is the context. Is that calling
yeah,
isn't neutral,
yeah.
and I love how, and I know it's more in your second book, but I love how you co- contrast the individualistic as in relation to the collectivistic
Mhm,
community, which is such a North American thing to have to deal with.
mhm.
Um, and we just recently, last weekend at the church, had a Ugandan pastor with us, and he talked about how his marriage had happened and just the whole involvement of families on every side and the decision and the bride price, but the bride price wasn't really a price; it was proving that
Mm,
he could
mm,
support and that his family
mm.
could support, and that's just lost in our culture. So
Yeah,
when
yeah.
so when you talk about that calling isn't neutral, that it's shaped by our culture, why is that idea so disruptive in Christian spaces?
That's kind of an interesting question, um, because on the one hand, I don't find it disruptive, I find
Okay,
it freeing,
sure.
and when I work with people, they find it freeing.
Okay.
The notion that Nothing about their personality, their family, their context, their experience, their culture, their language, their sense of identity, nothing about that is a surprise to God,
Right. Sure.
right? It's not calling is one thing and then there's you being different, right?
Right.
So if we think about that, if we think about Ephesians 2:10, that we are God's workmanship,
Hmm.
created in Christ Jesus to do good works that he prepared in advance to be our way of life, right? That if we're God's craftsmanship, what is God crafting? I would argue that God crafts and uses all of our identities.
Right.
Now, are there things that need redeeming? Absolutely. Do we need transformation? Yes, we do.
Certainly.
Is there sin involved? Of course.
Yeah.
Yes, there is. So
Yeah.
so we have this mixed bag, like it's just true, we're human. Um, and that's the context in which God works. So I'm North American. And so I default to being individualistic. I think
Sure.
about calling as being a personal, individual thing. Yeah, that's where I come from. If I can hold that, if I can own it, that's who I am. That's what shaped me.
Right.
And then I can sit with an open hand to listen to, so what is your experience? What about the Ugandan pastor, right? And
Right.
you get a taste of, oh, the kingdom is bigger and richer and more complex and beautiful
Sure.
than I could imagine just sitting in my own space.
Yeah.
I do recognize that there would be people currently in the present moment who find talking about identity
Mm.
and talking about race and ethnicity, talking about gender, talking about
Sure.
class, all of these kinds of
Yeah.
things,
Right.
ability, disability, um, would find it, disruptive and uncomfortable,
Sure. And the
uh,
political moment we're in right now doesn't
in
encourage that.
particular.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much
I'm
so.
in Canada, so
Okay.
I'm an onlooker. I'm an onlooker.
Yeah. No, I have an interesting time talking with my Canadian friends, colleagues, and
Certainly.
anyway, yeah. Yeah, pray for us. So it is yes, so there is, it is interesting talking about these things in the current
Mhm.
political environment.
Yeah.
And what I think we've actually seen is, what we're seeing
Sure.
is
Of course.
fear-based, and
Yeah.
so there's this backlash, and what that suggests to me is that we have a church, particularly if I can say it this way, a white church
Mhm.
that is incapable, has shown itself incapable of dealing with the disruption of a diverse community.
Sure, and it's not
It's
new.
it's
It's
not
not
new at
new.
all.
It's not
I mean,
new.
go back to Acts 6,
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
you
I
know?
recently talked with Lisa Bowens, and her book, African American
Mm,
readings of Paul. I think is just monumental in terms of,
mm,
understanding that as a dominant, whatever socioeconomic dyn group, um, sometimes our hermeneutic is suspicious.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
Because there's that human nature involved there.
Yeah,
One thing I
yeah.
found really interesting as you, and I can't recall which book exactly it was, but when you talk about calling and somebody being called, feeling this sense of call, and you certainly hinted at it earlier on, but then their cultural environment or their religious environment restricts that calling.
Mhm.
How do people work through that?
How people work through that in an individualistic context is different
Mm,
than how they work through it in a collectivist context.
sure.
So I was fascinated working with a doctoral student from Cote d'Ivoire
Yeah.
in West Africa,
Mhm.
and how he was looking at exactly that question. How do
Yes.
people process when when there's conflict in their family? And in his instance, he was looking at people who specifically felt a sense of call to pastoral ministry,
Right.
and their families were concerned about how are you going to support the family?
Sure.
And it's a different social cultural context.
Yes.
And the processing, it was just fascinating to me how in that instance, one of his findings, Kelly Kumbu, let me just name
Sure.
instead of just talking about him
Yeah.
generically, how Dr. Kumbu looked at one of his findings was that a person of peace was really important. Somebody who
Mm,
had position in the family, often a mother, a relative, an older relative who
Okay.
would advocate for the individual and
Okay.
for their sense of calling,
Yeah.
that was a really important part of the process, and
Right.
that's fascinating. Or a conversation I had a number of years ago with a group of South African pastors from a northern part of South Africa,
Hmm.
and, they kept using this phrase, "When I received my call," and initially, I didn't hear and understand. I thought about it
Sure.
individualistically,
Sure.
but a colleague was with me, and she really helped me understand, no, they're saying when the community determined I was called.
Right.
You know,
Right.
so for them, there was, like, this proving season where they served, and they pursued that sense of what they felt called to, and the community had to be won over in
Right.
a sense,
Right.
which
Which
is
is wonderful.
different than, say, somebody who's, you're 25, you've gotten a degree in I don't know what in college, you're supposed to be an engineer and you discover you really hate engineering and you
Right.
want to, I don't know, be a teacher,
Yeah.
something, and you're needing to argue with your family about what you're doing and why you're doing it. There's maybe a different kind of how do I individually advocate for my individual agency to perceive God,
Right.
that just kind of comes through differently. Um,
Somewhat ironic that you use that illustration. My best friend in high school, that is the exact
uh,
situation he
uh,
was in.
okay, okay. Yeah. So, and we have a lot of those, and maybe, at least I'm hopeful that if we can think about that there are social cultural norms
Right.
that surround our assumptions, maybe if we step back from some of the binary language of, like, sometimes we use God language in really coercive
Sure.
ways.
Sure.
Yeah. And if okay, so maybe my family can't step back, but maybe I can step back and say, okay, there are some cultural reasons why my family really wants me to do
Right.
X, really
Sure.
wants me to be an engineer.
Yeah. Mhm.
And can I understand that and can I have empathy for that?
Right.
And can that help me maybe tell them stories or reframe what I'm processing with them, reframe my narrative in a way that they can perceive it?
Right.
Or to just understand that's their concern, that's going to be their concern. I can't dress their concern. I'm gonna have to trust God, but I can be respectful to them
Right.
and honor myself
Right.
instead of making it a point of conflict, that one of us has to be right and one of us has to be wrong.
Sure. Sure. Now I'm thinking, I'm thinking back a bit to, again, your first, kind of illustration from your own life, growing
Mm,
up in a conservative evangelical church. In a way, and I don't think you're trying to say this, but in a way, when there's a how do I put it? Here's a woman called to ministry. She's in an
mhm,
evangelical conservative gospel coalition church,
mhm.
and, there's just no place for her,
Yeah,
and yet
yeah,
she feels that call.
yeah.
I mean, we're almost saying that God just can't call people in that context.
Or are we leaving space to say that sometimes the church rejects the gifts that God gives, right?
Oh, definitely the case.
Right? And that okay, so this is one of it you're touching on something maybe not intending to, but you're touching on something that I really noodle on. Because one of my cultural assumptions is
Mm,
that if we follow God and we're pursuing God's purposes in our life and, responding to that, that somehow that automatically leads to quote unquote success,
right,
right?
right,
So we love the stories of so and so persevered and overcame opposition, and then they planted a church and it's now 30,000 people,
right,
and isn't this
sure.
wonderful, right? We
Yeah,
love
I don't
those
follow those
stories.
Instagram feeds anymore, but
Yeah, no,
yeah.
it's fine. We love those stories because that's a
Sure.
cultural narrative. That's
Yeah,
a hero story in our
yeah,
cultural context. What if what if that person called that people don't respond to and don't recognize and don't receive the gift of God? What if faithfulness is the really important issue for that person and
sure.
not quote unquote success?
Right.
Which is like, I don't preach that to people. When
No,
people are receiving opposition, I
sure.
don't say, suck it up. Maybe you just need to be like the Old Testament prophets who never got received, but they
Right.
were faithful, and so God approves of
Sure.
them. I don't. I'm never going to preach that to somebody. And I am going to want to explore with people, okay, so what is going on? Like, what do you see under this opposition and this resistance? What can
Hmm.
you learn from that? What are ways you might be able to process that? So I am going to always want to explore those things, as well as maybe there's wisdom in the group. Maybe there's opposition for some reason that you actually need to pay attention to.
Sure.
Um, all those kind of things. So I'm not going to preach that, but I do wonder. I do wonder if we're a little bit too quick to assume that if God calls us and we obey, then we're going to get everything we sense God calling us to. And God doesn't seem to be that invested
He
in
doesn't. Yes.
that accomplishing that. Irritatingly, God does not seem to be
Now
invested in it.
you're teaching Christian leadership. I mean,
Hmm.
that's what you're teaching. And so, here we've got in leadership, I come from a group of churches that are very much a leadership oriented, we have a leadership culture. But so in that leadership dialogue becomes fruitfulness and faithfulness. And if I'm
Hmm.
a good leader, I'm fruitful,
Yeah.
and faithful isn't really the same. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but is that then a Western cultural mindset?
To some extent it is.
Hmm.
I think our assumption that fruitfulness looks like numbers
Right,
is very Western.
right,
That you can measure fruitful.
right.
It's by the number of people, that how many butts are in the pews?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
How many books did you sell?
yeah.
How many people how many people are subscribed to your podcast?
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Right? That we quantify things. I think that is very Western.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
That goes with our kind of,
But
sort of
but
scientific
we're
mentality.
ministering in a Western culture,
Yeah, we are. And
you
that
know?
and that's what people do. So, leaders, I will get often people who are in pastoral ministry in some form, and they feel that pressure.
Right,
People, a lot of youth ministers, for example,
right.
and they have that pressure. All the parents are eyeballing them.
Oh,
It's like, we're paying your salary to
sure.
keep our kid on the straight and narrow and shepherd them through the perils of current cultural dynamics, and that's your job.
I used
That's
to
what
be
we're
a
paying
youth
you for.
pastor, that one bothers me, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's like, I'm so sorry. You're gonna have to fail their expectations,
Right.
but to quote one of my favorite leadership, authors, Ronald Heifetz, um, "You have to fail their expectations at a rate they can handle."
Mm. Oh, that's good.
So now we're getting into
Yeah,
change dynamics here,
yeah, sure. That's
like,
exactly, yeah.
you have to, like, stay on the job,
Yes.
and that okay, so now this gets back to calling. Discerning what is faithful to God.
Mm.
Because faithful to God may mean that I have to be unfaithful
Right,
to the parental expectations,
right, right.
which is really hard. Because okay, you do need a job and put a roof over your head and,
Sure.
food on the table.
Yeah,
Those kinds of concerns are
yeah,
legitimate. You
yeah.
also care about those kids, and want them to thrive, and you recognize this generational tension. I see this a lot in youth ministers, and so where's God in that?
Right,
What is God up to?
right,
And so instead of just viewing it as we have this generational thing and parents have this thing and kids have this thing and here's the cultural context and here's the dynamics that are making it complicated. It's like, okay, let's assume God is at work in this.
right.
What would it look like to be curious? What are you up to, God? What would it look like to
I love it.
cultivate curiosity in ourselves and in the people we're leading? What if we
Right.
got curious with the kids?
Yeah, yeah.
How,
That'd be
what
excellent.
is God up to? How do we know what God's up to? What does that look like? What do we think? What are we sensing?
Right,
How might we want to experiment with? I think I have a sense of God is doing this thing here. I want to talk about this kind of stuff. How can we experiment with that a little bit to say,
right.
okay, let's try something out? And is okay? Where did we sense God in that, and where did we not sense God in that? And could we be a little bit more playful?
Sure. I almost, we need to learn to ask different questions. Um,
Yeah.
the wrong question. One of the things, talking about metrics, just popping back to that for a moment. One of the things I loved in in the second book, The Power, Agency, and Women in the Mission of God, you talk about bringing women into. You spend quite a bit of time talking about how some practical ways of bringing women in,
Hmm.
and other.
Hmm.
And it's not just women that are
Yeah.
underutilized. I mean, okay, but we're just using an example. Um, and one of the things, you go back again to the Imago Dei and Missio Dei, and in relation to God's, as it were, feminine characteristics, and
Mm,
the metric not just being numbers but relational.
mhm,
I love that particular spot in the book where you talked about that. Then we'd have, a relational metric rather than just a body count, I guess.
mm, mm, mm,
So I don't know. Can you say can you maybe talk a little bit more about how bringing the different voices
mhm,
into this. Let me back that up a bit. Let me the real question I'm getting at is this, is I pastor a church, and I want to be able to, not just, tokenize the Syrians in the
mm,
church, the Ukrainians, the Zimbabweans, the Latinos, because I know I'm coming from a point of white privilege. I know that, but I can't
mhm,
see past it. I just don't know.
mhm,
So,
mhm,
what are some of the very practical things in a church setting, let's talk there, that we can
mm.
do to, permit that and allow that and celebrate that? I don't want just allow it, I want to celebrate it.
Yeah. Hmm. I think one of the dynamics that I value is growing in our understanding of being an intercultural community.
Right,
We can be a diverse community, but not be intercultural,
right. Yes.
right? So we
Yeah,
could celebrate and we could have I don't know, a World Nations Sunday where we have everybody's flag
sure.
and everybody
Yeah.
dresses up, or we
I've been in
could,
those. Yeah.
which are
Yeah.
great. Like
Sure.
celebrating is good.
Yeah.
We could have foods and everybody brings their
Yeah.
foods and we can celebrate all the different things we have. Um, I would like to advocate for going beyond celebration into interdependence.
Okay. So what's that look like?
Well, that's a question I'm working on. So my husband and I, let me get into the concrete a little bit more,
Yeah.
because I can't I, at the moment I can't draw back out to the abstract. I'm really living in the concrete of it.
Yeah. I
My
love it.
husband and I attend an intergenerational, intercultural, bilingual church.
Sure.
So we do everything, and I mean everything, in Spanish and English,
Sure.
which means everything takes twice as long.
It does.
And then on top of that, we're intercultural, so we have people I did a quick count one time, and people from 13 different nations.
Sure.
So we all have different ways of doing things, and sometimes we have fun. So, like, Christmas time, one of the Central and South American things at Christmas is tamales.
Yes.
And we get this thing going about, okay, do you like the El Salvadorian tamales, or do you like the Mexican tamales, or do you like the Guatemalan tamales? And
Sure.
I know better than to it's like, I
Pick
love
a
them
side.
all for
Yeah.
different reasons. Like, I'm not gonna claim a favorite. Um, and those are fun things, and those are celebration,
Mhm.
and
Mm.
what are we doing to make sure that, people are feel welcomed at the table, not just
Right.
invited.
Right.
But whose voice are we missing? And so
Right.
things like, we do a lot in our church, at different times around preaching teams.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, and so our pastor, Marcos Canales, will he's very, welcoming. He's not one of these pastors who has to preach all the time, although he is a good preacher and he likes to preach. Um, and so when we're forming those, when we have a sermon series and we're thinking about, okay, who's the preaching team?
Right.
Paying attention to, okay, who else can be invited?
Right.
Who else could grow into this?
Yeah.
What voices are we missing?
Right.
We're very conscious about, these are still a lot of Sunday morning kind of things, but
Mhm.
always having a woman and a man doing the announcements
Okay.
and all of those
Yeah.
welcoming and all those kind of things.
Yeah.
When I preach,
Yeah.
I've almost always had a man translate for
Right.
me,
Okay.
but you
Yeah.
know, but if Pastor Marcos is preaching, it's almost always a woman who's translating
Okay.
for him.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Hey,
this kind of thing.
yeah, that's cool.
So these are the sorts of, how do we practically, concretely make space for, invite people, keep asking the question
Right.
of who is at the table, who's welcome at the table. And a lot of it, at least in this context, and our associate pastor, Pastor Rosa, um, kind of the first Spanish word she taught me was confianza, which
Okay.
is
With
roughly
trust. Yeah.
translates to trust, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And so con
I'm bilingual, so
confianza,
yeah.
okay, so we have to develop confianza, and that takes
Yes.
time, it takes
Sure.
relationship, it takes serving together, it takes playing together, it takes
Right.
working together. So that's one of the things in our churches, if we're still thinking on the Western production mentality and we
Mhm.
think of church as a product,
Right.
then we're not gonna be developing much relationship because it's about you come, you consume a product, you leave,
Right.
we've
Yeah.
done church.
Sure.
Well,
Yeah.
what are we doing to foster relationship? And I don't know how to lick this in predominantly white churches. Like, I just don't know.
Sure.
I love being in a predominantly Latina church because like this familia is so important in
Yes.
this
Certainly.
context. People stick together even
Yeah.
across
Yeah.
major political divides and major socioeconomic divides and major experience divides because familia is so important.
Yes.
I don't know how to do it in a white church. I guess I would wonder for you, for anybody who is okay, so I am the pastor in the church. I recognize I'm white. I recognize I'm going to come from white. I'm going to assume whiteness
Right.
as my norm because that's how I've been shaped, which I
Yeah.
do too.
Yeah.
I do as a professor.
Yeah.
It's like I cannot stop being white.
Yeah.
Like I'm white.
I am. Yeah.
I'm white. It's what shaped me. What I can do is be asking that question of who am I listening to? Who am I developing
Mm.
relationship with?
Sure.
Um, Not for the sake of how do I serve you, because that's easy. That's
Right.
top down,
Yeah. But
right?
that's
That's me enacting power. It's
colonialism. Yeah.
exactly. But what relationship are we developing? Allow it to take time to grow into a place of mutuality.
Right. Right. I'm loving this conversation. It's not. I know we're not talking so much about calling and vocation as I thought, but yet you touch on a lot of these things in
Hmm. Hmm.
power and dynamics. And the church you're in, just a little background. I lead a multi-site church, and we also have a diverse preaching team. I wasn't preaching on Sunday, so I went to one of our locations where we had our first fully bilingual service. A Spanish couple. He preached and she translated.
Hmm.
The words were on the screen were both Spanish and English. The scripture was Spanish and English, and people
Hmm.
were crying in the seats.
Hmm. Hmm.
And not
Yeah.
just those who spoke Spanish, but we had a couple. I had dinner with them last night. They were second Sunday in church. They were from the UK, and he said, "I don't know why, but when those words came up, I started to cry."
Hmm.
And we do in some of our other locations. We have the public reading of scripture. We always read it in a language other than English.
Hmm.
It's an easy thing that we can do, and I constantly get the comments of, "I that just meant so much to me."
Hmm.
So I think some of that, I guess in some ways that feels like low-hanging fruit for churches.
Hmm.
Um, those are easy steps for them to take. I think easy steps for them to take. Um, the places that I find harder are things like having a conversation with somebody whose language isn't English
Hmm.
and trying to make sure I don't slow down. Uh, there's something that happens in my head. You don't understand what I'm saying. I'm talking to somebody who doesn't understand, but that's not the problem. The problem is the
Hmm.
language.
Hmm.
So I don't have an answer. I'm hoping you do. So
We keep trying. We keep being disciples. It's close to an answer, but there are low hanging fruit, yes. And do we persevere?
yeah, sure.
Right. So it's one thing to have a bilingual service for a few months or a year or two,
Yeah, yeah,
but do you keep going when everybody's tired and it's really hard to find translators and
yeah.
bilingual people to do
Right.
all that?
Yeah, yeah,
It's are you really gonna is it important enough to keep going?
yeah.
Or are
Sure.
you gonna give up?
Yeah, yeah. I
Right?
mean, our vision statement, part of our vision statement, I'm just talking about us, is that we want the church to be as diverse as heaven. I just have
Mm,
this I have a theological problem with having a Spanish speaking church and an English speaking church,
mm,
because I don't think we get to do that in heaven.
mm,
Um,
mm,
so I'm constantly trying to find a way that we can celebrate and
yeah,
use and that you don't feel like I have to go to a different church so that I can hear it in my language. No, we're going to have it here. Everybody's
yeah,
going to be uncomfortable.
yeah. Yeah, well, and for those of us who are used to being monolingual,
Mm,
we've never had to deal with not understanding the language.
yes.
a bilingual context can be really challenging.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Because we're not used to not understanding something,
Yeah.
and that's another place. Are we going to persevere past the discomfort,
Yeah.
and see that um, language diversity is valuable, and over time, like I and the songs that I sing in Spanish, I have enough vocabulary now that I can understand them, right? And so
Sure.
they become precious in their own right, even though
Sure.
that's not my heart language, but it becomes more vital with time and practice. But that's years. That's
Yeah,
not
it is.
a couple weeks or a month or
No,
two.
no, it's yours. And
Yeah.
language and culture, I think another thing maybe in the culture areas, you have a bilingual um, service, but that bilingual service is still made up of many nations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
they're Spanish speaking, but
Yeah.
Mexican is different from Guatemalan,
Yep.
from San
Argentinian from
Antonian,
Chilean from
and
Peruvian. Yep. Yep.
exactly.
Yep.
And so
Yep.
there's a lot of um, we forget those things as well.
Yeah.
Forget those things as
Yeah.
well. Wow,
Now,
that's interesting.
where that comes up, so a deeper level too, beyond the conversations that you already mentioned, what do we do with our budgets, and how do we decide what we do with our budgets, right?
Mm,
A lot of cultural stuff comes up there.
mhm.
What is a priority? Who
Right,
gets to decide,
right,
right?
right.
And
Yeah.
that's one of those places where, well, are we going to actually be intercultural? I've seen a lot. You've probably seen them too. A lot of churches that, by the standard of the literature, would be multi-ethnic churches,
Right,
but all the systems and structures are dominated by a single culture,
right. Sure.
right? So when it comes to hiring practices, and what are the qualifications that are
Right.
necessary to pay scale, to HR concerns,
Mhm.
to the budgeting, to missions budget, what constitutes mission?
Right,
All of those kinds of questions.
right,
What are the voices that get to make those decisions? And
right,
do they come from a single culture?
right,
Or are we making space for the diversity of voices, which takes exponentially longer to process? It is messier, it is harder, is way complex.
sure.
So and that tests our resolve. Are we really committed to being intercultural? Or do we just is diversity the flavor of the month?
Right.
And, aren't we cool? Look at we have diversity. Um,
Exactly.
you know, there's a space in between. Like, there's a long continuum in between. It's not either or,
Yeah,
but
there is,
what are
yeah.
we showing with our um with those really practical things? What are we showing we value?
And the goal ultimately is that we are all in the Imago Dei, and
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
means we all have that contribution. We're all
Yeah.
called to that. We're all
Yeah.
let's not let our systems or our structure become the barrier.
Yeah.
I know, when you talk about structure and who gets to speak into things, I immediately think of some cultures honor, high honor shame cultures that we
Mhm.
have in our church that
Mhm.
won't speak up,
Mhm.
um, and we have to find a way to allow them to feel comfortable
Yeah.
speaking into that.
Yeah, and how do we ourselves, who those of us who come from low context cultures,
Mm,
where it's like just individual, you just speak the truth, and right?
right,
Which I'm never somebody from a high context culture is never gonna tell me, is never gonna disagree with me to my face. Like,
right.
that will never happen. So it's
Right.
not a case of how do I help them feel comfortable?
No,
It's
yeah.
how do I learn how
Yes.
to hear disagreement
Sure.
in a way that's not my own cultural
Sure.
preference.
Yeah.
And so this gets into the missiological side of the stuff that I do, and why missiology still is really important to me is, this is our interculturality as a capital C church
Right.
of, all peoples, all nations, tribes, tongues, nations. Uh, well, there's a lot of diversity there, and there's a lot to be, as you've alluded to already. There's something rich about the nature and character of God that we discover
Yes.
by being diverse together.
Certainly. Yeah. Certainly. And I think our individualism works against us in that, for sure. I have enjoyed the conversation. I think
Mm.
we could go a long
Keep
ways.
going.
We could certainly keep going with this. I think there's so much here, but just kind of maybe just kind of as we get to the end, just a real pointed question. You're training future leaders at Fuller. What's
Mhm.
missing in how we teach, vocation, power in theological education?
Mm. Well, I think there's a revolution going on in
Mm,
education in general.
yeah.
As a field, it's hugely disrupted, and there's all kinds of chaos. And we'll see what happens when the dust settles someday. We'll have a new form of education that will survive at some point. A big piece of that is that we too often default to education as abstract.
Mm,
And students come in with an expectation of education as credentialing. If I get the degree,
sure.
I'm credentialed, therefore I should get the job. And it's like,
Right.
well, do you have the learning? Do you have the transformation? And then from the faculty side, we live in this abstract kind of world, even if we say we really care about practitioners. So for me, I really want to see in education. Um, I want to see us grapple with what does it mean to be really formational,
Mhm.
to be disciple makers, and to not say that's the church's job, that's the local church's job, that's not our job. We're not disciple makers, And it's like, well,
Right.
we're always forming people,
Right.
so we can be forming them or we can be malforming them. And
Right.
if we're not paying attention to the human person, to our context,
Mhm.
to where God is at work in us, if we're not shaping some space where the spirit can be at work in
Yeah.
our lives
Yes.
as faculty, as administration, as staff, let alone making space in the classroom. If classroom's only about information, we're
Yeah.
toast. It
Yeah.
has to be about, okay, what is the spirit up to? So I'll come back to that again, right?
Yes.
What is God up to? God is
Yes.
at work. What is God up to? And what's the invitation
Yeah.
to us to participate in that? And that can be in the classroom, in assignments, in all sorts of things, as well as in our job, at home, in the
Right.
grocery store, on the road, wherever it is. And it kind of coming back to that question: God is at work. How do I perceive that? And how do I perceive God's invitation and cooperate with that
Right.
invitation?
Yeah, which is incredible. Yeah. I mean, I do see, like you say, I do see encouraging signs in academics. My context mostly is Southeastern.
Mm,
But and going back to I did my graduate work there, 2 years ago, so I went back to school after a long time, and I was really in har it was really heartening to me to see how many of the professors were pastors,
mm, mm,
practitioners, and, just coming back from SBS, and I know you're involved in the practical theology, interest
yeah.
group. Again, the same thing, so many pastors, wanting to bring that and connecting those 2. So, hopefully a little bit of our conversation today might help some pastors and help some churches, and
Yeah.
at least to think through some things, and, so I wanna thank you again for taking the time to be here. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and,
Likewise. A lot of fun.
I hope, we get a chance to maybe meet up at SBS next year.
There we go.
Might just do that. All right. Well, thanks again, Dr. Maris. I really appreciate, you being with me today, and,
Thank you.
we will, hopefully chat again.
This has been the Ask a Theologian podcast with your host, Dave Olson. It's a passion for Dave to have on theologians that break down the often dense and technical world of theology into approachable, user-friendly ideas. No thought or questions are off the table. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, find us on Instagram at the Ask a Theologian podcast. And on X, it's Ask Theologian. Take care, and we'll see you next time on the Ask a Theologian podcast.